us coast to coast for events, meetings, or announcements to bring them to life. More at avfx.com/virtual. On the next Fresh Air, taking on racial bias in law enforcement one department at a time. We speak with Philip Atiba Goff, co-founder of the Center for Policing Equity, about working with local police departments on strategies to reduce racial disparities in car stops, searches, and the use of force. Join us this afternoon at 3 and again tonight at 7 on WHYY.
Artificial intelligence can be highly susceptible to bias. The potential for serious consequences is huge, especially when it comes to AI increasingly used in policing trials. We'll hear from a man wrongfully arrested due to facial recognition technology, a lawyer researching how dirty data has corrupted predictive policing algorithms, and a researcher who says that de-biasing AI isn't enough. AI Nation, listen now wherever you get your podcasts.
And you're listening to WHYY coming up on 1 o'clock. It's a chilly day out there. 47 degrees in Narberth, Pennsylvania. 56 degrees in Narberth, Wales.
This is WHYY FM Philadelphia. WNJN FM 89.7 Atlantic City. WNJZ 90.3 Cape May Courthouse. WNJB FM 89.3 Bridgeton. WNJM 89.9 Manahawkin. And WNJS FM 88.1 Berlin.
Funding for Here and Now comes from MathWorks, creators of MATLAB and Simulink software, accelerating the pace of engineering and science. Learn more at mathworks.com. From NPR and WBUR Boston, I'm Tanya Wilson.
I'm Peter Rundown. It's Here and Now. Coming up, a promise from President Biden to cut greenhouse gas emissions in half by the end of the decade. How will he get there?
Also, as the nation confronts police use of force, lessons from one department in Bellevue, Washington.
You know, it's got to stand up to the test of our policies, our procedures, but also the community standards.
And poor Latino neighborhoods in the Southwest are up to 7 degrees hotter than wealthier, whiter neighborhoods. What's that mean for people in Tucson, Arizona?
You see little kids with red faces standing at the bus stop with their parents. It's really sad. You wish there was more shade structures for the bus stops.
These stories coming up here and now.
The news is first.
Live from NPR News, I'm Lakshmi Singh. Funeral services are being held this hour for Daunte Wright, the 20-year-old black man fatally shot during his encounter with police last week in suburban Minneapolis. From Minnesota Public Radio, Matt Sepik reports.
Wright was killed after former officer Kimberly Potter was heard on body camera video shouting at the was the murder trial of former officer Derek Chauvin behind the dead. Father was assigned to the Brooklyn Center Police Department and has been charged with manslaughter. Father should face a more serious for his
Earth Day is being marked by a global summit on climate change involving dozens of world leaders and some of the planet's most talking to environmental change. Perhaps the most prominent is teenager Greta Thunberg. She testified virtually today at a House Oversight Subcommittee on fossil fuels and the climate crisis.
Talking about different financial interests. I'm not a lobbyist, so I could negotiate, make a deal, compromise. I have nothing to offer you, nor am I a scientist. All I can do is urge you to listen to an activist scientist.
The global battle on climate change is also the focus of the first international summit President Biden convened since he took office in January. He pledged that the United States will reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by half from 2005 levels by the end of the decade. 200 million COVID-19 vaccine doses have been administered in this country since Biden took office. NPR's Cameron Keith reports people aged 16 and older are now eligible to receive the shots. The pace of inoculations doesn't seem to be speeding up.
There are still a lot of people who want to get vaccinated, but just need the process to be convenient and easy. Others will need to be convinced.
Ada Stewart is doing that convincing every day. She's president of the Association of Family Physicians and a practicing doctor in South Carolina.
Great. I said, so now you're going to be part of that building my community of immunity. Yes, I'm going to check you out.
Because primary care physicians are so trusted, White House officials say they need vaccines distributed to more doctors' offices. Tamara Keith, NPR News. The Dow Jones Industrial Average is down 16 points to 34,121. This is NPR News.
Good afternoon, it's 1:04. I'm Avi Wolfman-Arrett, and this is WHYY News. The Philadelphia Police Department has arrested one of its own for an assault that took place at the end of December. According to the police account, Detective Robert Redenauer was off duty when he grabbed a semi-automatic handgun from a dresser and threatened to shoot one of two people in a home. The individuals were able to get away from Redenauer and call the police. It's unclear what Redenauer's relationship is with the people he threatened. The district attorney's office has charged Redenauer with simple assault and recklessly endangering another person. Philadelphia Police Commissioner Danielle Outlaw has suspended Redenauer for 30 days with the intent to dismiss. There's a new anti-violence proposal in Philadelphia based on an old idea. WHYY's Tom McDonald has more.
In the 1970s, the House of Umoja, one of the original anti-violence groups in Philadelphia, negotiated peace treaties between rival gangs to cut down on city violence. Councilmember Curtis Jones says he's willing to revive the practice if it can help.
Most recently, I was approached, and I won't mention the groups, to have such a negotiation. For the most part, we have not been able to get around our table, get to the heart of some of the problems, get young men and women to commit to a period of peace.
Jones says the deals could have incentives attached through anti-violence funding.
Access to jobs and other kind of incentives to come up with a binding peace treaty for a period of time, like a summer or even a year.
The plan Jones is trying to push would have members of the clergy and other community leaders sitting down with rivals to broker the de-escalation of violence in the city. Tom McDonald, WHYY News.
Let's talk sports. Sixers were down 3 starters last night, still nearly pulled off a win over the Phoenix Suns. Fell 116 to 113. Joel Embiid nearly tied the game at the end with maybe the most impressive missed shot I have ever seen. You should Google it. Sixers are back at it tonight against Milwaukee. They take on the Bucks at 7. This is WHYY.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include Charles Schwab. Charles Schwab is committed to offering a modern approach to wealth management with personalized financial planning to meet an investor's specific needs. Learn more at schwab.com/plan.
From NPR and WBUR, I'm Tanya Mosley.
And I'm Peter O'Dowd. This is Here and Now. It is Earth Day, and President Biden is making big promises. He kicked off an international climate summit by pledging to cut the country's greenhouse gas emissions in half by 2030, and he urged world leaders to work together in his opening remarks to the virtual conference.
This is a moral imperative, an economic imperative, a moment of peril, but also a moment of extraordinary possibilities. Time is short, but I believe we can do this, and I believe that we will do this.
NPR national correspondent Jeff Brady is following this story. And Jeff, this is a pretty ambitious goal. What would the U.S. need to do to cut emissions by half?
Well, we're certainly going to get more details in coming months before a big climate meeting in Glasgow in November. But we know the administration wants to set a national clean energy standard. That would require increasing amounts of electricity generated from fuels that don't emit the greenhouse gases fossil fuels do now. And in the president's more than $2 trillion infrastructure proposal, there's a fundamental remaking of the country's entire power grid, phasing out coal power plants, more renewable energy, and more transmission lines to get wind and solar power to where it's needed. The administration frames this as an economic opportunity. All that work will require hiring lots and lots of people to do it. And the administration wants big changes in transportation. Biden wants a fast ramp up of electric vehicles, so he's proposing incentives to buy EVs and more charging stations around the country.
That infrastructure plan you mentioned would need to pass through Congress. How much help does he need from lawmakers to make cuts this deep?
Yeah, Congress is going to have to take action, and we're already seeing bills circulating that likely will become part of a bigger package in coming weeks. One of the big challenges this administration faces is that Democrats have a narrow margin in the Senate. They have a better chance of getting some things passed through budget reconciliation, but some items might not be able to be included in a reconciliation package. The administration says it wants help from Republican lawmakers, but it's not clear they're going to get it.
And no matter what happens on Capitol Hill, the president is clearly sending a message here that the U.S. wants to lead on climate change after the Trump administration dropped out of the Paris Climate Accord. Do you get the sense, Jeff, that the international community is hearing that message?
Yes, other countries responding by increasing their own commitments today to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Japan increased its emission reductions from 26% to 46%. That's based on 2013 levels. South Korea vowed to no longer finance coal power plant construction in other countries. One environmental group called that a historic step. And Brazil's president, Jair Bolsonaro, increased his country's commitment, aiming for carbon neutrality by 2050. That's a decade earlier than a previous commitment. And Bolsonaro reaffirmed his country's pledge to end illegal deforestation in the Amazon by 2030. But he also has said that Brazil should be paid for keeping the Amazon intact, and figuring that out may be a sticking point down the road.
Well, and then there's China. Chinese President Xi Jinping spoke after Biden today. China, of course, now the world's biggest greenhouse gas emitter. Here's President Xi through an interpreter.
China will strive to peak carbon dioxide emissions before 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality before 2060. China has committed to move from carbon peak to carbon neutrality in a much shorter time span than what might take many developed countries.
So, promising peak emissions by 2030, that is a contrast from Biden's promise to cut them in half by then. Can you put what China is trying to do into context?
Yeah, it's still significant. There were questions about whether China was even going to show up to this summit, so just being there is important. And under the Paris Agreement, there's a recognition that developing economies don't have the long history of emitting greenhouse gases that countries like the U.S. do. So emerging economies were given more time to get their emissions under control. China is coming back now and saying it will limit the increase of coal consumption in the next 5 years and phase it down in the 5 years after that. It's an important commitment, but of course one that many will be watching to hold China accountable.
I understand that scientists are warning that the world is already way behind where it needs to be with emissions. So do you think that what Biden is promising and what China and others are promising, will that even be enough to prevent a climate disaster?
Well, we know that the Paris Climate Agreement wasn't enough, and the U.S. wasn't even on track to meet those commitments. Now countries are boosting their pledges, and even more is needed on top of that. We're already seeing the effects of climate change with more extreme heat waves, storms, and wildfires. Still, you know what's happening now? This is progress. There are no enforcement mechanisms to hold countries accountable for these promises. They all have to trust each other to live up to the commitments that they're making, and then, of course, increase them again in the future.
NPR's Jeff Brady, thank you very much.
Thank you.
More than half of all Americans have received at least one dose of a COVID-19 vaccine, and in some states the numbers are much lower. In Alabama, for instance, 30% of people are fully or partially vaccinated, and there are several reasons why. Some people are hesitant or indifferent, or they simply don't have access, and racial disparities persist. So how are doctors there reaching out to patients of color? Let's bring in Dr. Dina Maxwell-Stafford, who is a family physician at Tuskegee, Alabama, which is 96% black. It's also the site where the infamous Tuskegee syphilis study was carried out, which has loomed over this pandemic in the minds of many Americans. Dr. Stafford, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. You know, let's start with this idea of folks being hesitant. How have they been expressing that hesitancy to you, and how are you responding to it?
So I think when we talk about hesitancy, we need to really focus that we have hesitancy and we have vaccine refusal. We have a lot more people that are just in that stage of, I need to understand more, I have some concerns. In Tuskegee, we have a lot of people who are directly impacted by the public health study on syphilis. And so when people initially hear about this new treatment, new availability, they have some concerns. And so one of the things that I try to talk to them about is that this is a little different in the sense that we know that this has positive outcomes and that the government is actively trying to get this to vulnerable populations. This is almost the exact opposite of what was done when they allowed disease to progress untreated. Now we're saying we have an intervention that's helpful and we want to get it to the most vulnerable population.
This is interesting because what you're saying here is that you're having conversations that are long overdue with community members about the Tuskegee experiment. It was several decades ago, and still it's at the forefront of many people's minds. When